All right, so I grew up in Sunday school. Any fellow grew up in Sunday schoolers? Remember that? That was a thing. So I learned all kind of Bible stories. Now my parents did a really good job. I didn't just learn Bible stories in Sunday school, but I did learn a lot of them in Sunday school, or at least they were reinforced. And we had storybook Bibles and stuff, and my parents read those to us, and just learned all the stories, right? And when you're a kid, every story is like this heroic, grand, incredible thing. And you learn stories about heroes of the faith, and you learn some crazy stories, like some really crazy ones. And then you learn some ones that maybe don't seem quite as crazy, but then as you get older and maybe you start to read some of the stories for yourself, it's like, oh, there's way more going on there than I realized. And as a kid, I learned the stories of people like Gideon and Samson, who are people that are in chapter 8 of the story that we're going to talk about today. Now, the interesting thing about those two in particular is that as I got older and began to read their stories, something didn't make sense to me. It just never quite did. And what didn't make sense was that I still had this kind of image or picture in my mind of these guys as heroes. And then when I would read their stories in the book of Judges, there were significant portions of their story where I was like, I'm not sure these guys are heroes, at all. Not to mention the fact that while I learned the stories of Gideon, or I learned parts of the stories of Gideon and Samson growing up, I didn't learn the stories of people like Othniel or Deborah or Ehud or any of the other judges mentioned in the book of Judges. And I certainly didn't learn the stories at the end of the book of Judges. Because, man, they're ugly stories. Now, the book of Judges, which is chapter 8 in our story journey, if you were to make a movie out of the book of Judges, man, it would be exciting. It would be a great movie. But if you didn't know they were stories from the Bible, you'd watch the movie and you would not in a million years think that these were biblical stories. And so if you're not very familiar with the book of Judges, if you haven't read chapter 8 in the story, maybe you're not very familiar with the book of Judges, it's worth your time. But I'll warn you, there's a problem with the book of Judges. And the problem is that when people read it, a lot of times they don't know what to do with it. Now, before I jump into why exactly that is, and that's going to be kind of where we spend our time today, I do want to just very briefly get us caught up on where we are in the story. And so this is the timeline that we've shown just about every week. We've walked through creation, fall, flood, Abraham, Joseph, Moses. Last week we talked about Joshua. And when we left off with Joshua's story, we left off in this place where Israel, things were really great. Joshua was an incredible leader, and under Joshua, the nation of Israel finally took hold of the promised land that God had promised Abraham many, many years before. They were occupying it, they were living in it, and things were pretty good. And all the way up through Joshua's death and the death of the leaders who served with Joshua, things were pretty great. But unfortunately, those good things were not to be long-lived. They were very short-lived. And right after the book of Joshua in the Bible, we come to the book of Judges. Now, this is a book, again, with a couple problems. One of them is that the book of Judges is brutal. Just brutal. In terms of some of the things that happen in it and what actions people take, and there's lots of blood and violence and death, like a lot. There's also stories that can be very, very challenging because there are stories about sexual assault in the book of Judges, and it can really mess with people. And one of the reasons why is people can read this book, and if you grew up with a Sunday school understanding of the stories in the Bible, it can be this real crisis moment where it's like, wait a minute, I thought the Bible was all about heroes, and if these are heroes, what do I do with that? I don't. That was what never set well with me. I would read the book of Judges, and I would have this kind of, but Gideon and Samson are heroes. But they do really bad things. And how do you reconcile that? Another issue with the book of Judges is that, in my opinion, we've been talking throughout our story journey about the upper story and the lower story, how there's these kind of parallel stories happening at the same time in the Bible. The book of Judges, in my opinion, has one of, if not the biggest upper story, lower story gap. What I mean by that is when you read the book of Judges, you're mostly reading about lower story events that happened. There are some upper story things that kind of come in from time to time, but on the whole, it can be hard to understand what God is doing in the upper story, which then makes the book more problematic because it's like, well, why is this here? Why would this be included if it's about all these terrible things that people did? So we're going to explore that today. Now, I'm going to be very transparent for a moment. I've got my storybook open to chapter 8, and you probably can't see it very well. Maybe if you're online right now, you can see that. I don't know, but chapter 8 is titled "A Few Good Men and Women." Okay, here's my transparent moment. I think that's a terrible title, like an awful title for this book, for this chapter, because I don't think it's true. I don't think Judges has a few good men and women in it. There are a couple people who you might argue were decent, but I don't think that that's an accurate title at all. I think that contributes to this problem of thinking, well, man, if these people are heroes, what do we do with that? And so what I want to do today is I want to present a case for why I think that title is wrong and how we should maybe correctly view the book of Judges and this particular moment in this grand narrative that we've been looking at. This big story the Bible is telling. So what's going on here? We've got to remember the backstory that where we've been. We're coming out of this incredible period. Joshua has led Israel. Things are great. Do you guys know sometimes what happens in life when things are really, really good? Sometimes we stop doing the things that got us to things being really, really good. You know, sometimes we get complacent. Sometimes it's like, look, clearly I work out, okay? That was a joke. You can laugh at that. That was a joke. I haven't gained 70 pounds since college, but anyway. It's like, you know, if I wanted to get in really, really good shape and lose, 20, 30 pounds, worked hard, working out, exercising, then you get to where you lose 20 or 30 pounds, and then what? Well, some people, like me, stop working out. And so after enough repetitions of that in life, you're like, whatever, I just won't start. But we get to this place where it's like, all right, I've achieved my goals, things are good, and then we get complacent and we stop. And then what happens? You put the weight back on. The things that got you to that good place in life, you stop doing them. Look at what happens at the very beginning of the book of Judges. This is Judges chapter 2. One other brief thing before we jump into this. I want to remind you that at the end of last week's message, at the end of chapter 7, at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua is giving his final instructions to the nation of Israel, and he says, choose this day whom you will serve. Choose. Now, the context of that is that Joshua recognizes there are still many people in the promised land who don't follow the Lord, who don't follow the God of the Israelites. And Joshua knows if you don't make a choice, what's going to happen is you're going to end up just kind of slowly taking some steps away from God. That's important context for what's about to come. One other small bit of context that matters is that most biblical scholars believe that the writers of the book of Judges, the book of Ruth, and the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel were the same person. I buy into that because when we see what happens today, it is this incredible line from Joshua through Judges, through Ruth, through 1st and 2nd Samuel. There is an incredible part of the story that happens in these 4 books. They are so cohesive. They are so brilliant in what they're doing. That's important for us to consider as we start today. So, things have been good. Joshua has said, choose this day whom you will serve. Joshua chapter 2, starting in verse 7. This is the very beginning of chapter 8 in your storybook. It says, the people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. That line, that verse is a complete pivot point in this narrative. I said last week there was a pivot point, and that was true. It was a pivot toward the good. That line right there is a pivot toward an incredible amount of pain and destruction that is about to come. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they served the Baals. The Baals were ancient Near Eastern gods who did one very specific thing that the Lord found reprehensible. They engaged in child sacrifice. Or as a part of the worship of Baal, they would often engage in child sacrifice to please the gods. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of the raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Pause right there for just a moment and we'll pick back up. That can be a difficult passage to read because it explicitly says the Lord's hand was against them. I actually want to turn us back very quickly to something that Will, my friend Will, pointed out this week in our story group. He reminded me of a critically important moment in the book of Joshua. I believe it's in the book of Joshua, where there's this kind of weird prophet figure who shows up, and the armies ask, "Who are you for? Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" And in this moment, the prophet says, "I'm not for anybody. I'm for the armies of the Lord." The point is, even though Israel were God's chosen people, Israel was not God's army. They were just people. And God, we can look at something like this and say, well, how cruel that God would turn against them. But the reality is everything that God does, he does for our good. And so in this moment where God allows raiders to come in and begin to plunder the Israelites and where they enter into battle, what God is doing is he's trying to get Israel to remember that they need him. He's trying to get Israel to remember that the battles they've won in the past, they didn't win in their strength. They won because of God. And if they'll only remember that, then things will work out. So God is trying to get them to come back to him. This is a little bit like, if you've ever had a kid that's gotten in trouble at school. Now, I don't know how you may have handled this as a parent. When Mason, my middle, was very young, like 4, he stole a toy from Sunshine Preschool. He went to preschool here in this building. He brought home this little truck, little tiny green truck. And he pulled it out of his backpack, and we were like, "Buddy, where'd you get that truck?" And he was kind of evasive about it, because you don't have to teach a kid to lie. He's kind of evasive about it, and he finally admitted that he took it from school. And we were like, "Well, why did you do that?" And he made up some other lie, and as it turns out, he just took this truck. Nobody had told him he could, right? He just took the truck. So we said, "Okay, well, here's what's gonna happen, bud. You're gonna walk your butt back into school tomorrow with that truck in your hand, and you're gonna hand it to your teacher, and you're gonna say, 'I took this truck, that was wrong.'" And so he did. And he was not happy about it, but he did. Now, as a parent, I could have shielded him from that, but what would I have been teaching him? Like I could have taken the truck and handed it to the teacher and said, "I'm really sorry Mason took this." But what good does that do? This is the same thing. It's on a grander scale, and it can be hard to understand, but it's the same thing. God is giving over the nation of Israel to consequences that hopefully will turn them back in the right direction, okay? So all that said, let's continue, verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges. So every time the Lord's hand was against them, they were in great distress. And then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. And then Verses 18 and 19 describe all that is to come in the book of Judges. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and their stubborn ways. And those couple paragraphs describe everything that is to come in the book of Judges. There's a couple important things that I want to point out there. Number one, it talks about how God would relent. When Israel would come under great distress and they would cry out to the Lord would raise up a judge. Now, this isn't a judge like we think about sitting in a courtroom. Now, the judge would do things like settle disputes amongst people. That's true. But these judges were more of like regional, almost military leaders. And it says that God would raise up a judge, and then it said that God was with that judge throughout their lifetime. It is very important to note that what it does not say is that the judges were doing what God said, or that the judges were faithful to God. The book does not say that. It says that God was with the judges, not that the judges really paid any attention at all to what God did or said. That matters because, again, if we go back to this Sunday school understanding of some of the characters, I think we can mistakenly assume that because God raised up a leader, it meant that God was pleased with that leader. And that is not what the text says. And I don't think that's what we should assume at all. In fact, I would say that at key moments, there's this thing where God's Spirit will empower each of these judges to accomplish something great, some great act of deliverance. But the fact that God raised up a judge doesn't mean that God endorses that judge and everything that they do. It doesn't mean that at all. It could mean that, but it doesn't have to mean that. And so as a result, as we look at the stories of the judges, I think it's fair to say, okay, God used this person to do something. And this is where I say this upper story, lower story gap exists, because often the characters in the story, we should be seeing like good, positive characteristics in them. But to be really frank, in the book of Judges, there aren't a whole lot of good, positive things to see. I mean, there's a few, but there's not many. In fact, in the book of Judges, there are 6 judges listed by name. The first 3 they seem okay. There's nothing like glaring about them that's like, oh, they're bad. So the first 3, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, they seem to be all right. But the next 3, recall what we just read a moment ago about how God would raise up the judge would save and deliver Israel, and then after the judge died, Israel would do even more evil. There's this cycle that starts to form. They do evil, God raises a judge. The judge dies, they do more evil, worse evil, and worse and worse and worse and worse. And we see that reflected in the lives of the judges as well, because the next 3 just get progressively worse and worse and worse. The first being Gideon, who does do some courageous things and obeys the Lord in some significant ways. But he's also very violent and very angry. And his problems with anger lead him to do some very destructive and terrible things. And then after Gideon is a man named Jephthah, who we don't hear about because there isn't much redeeming in his story. And then after Jephthah is Samson, who probably, if you grew up in Sunday school, you heard about Samson. Samson was pretty terrible. Like if you read his story, it's, whew, man. God was with him, yes. The Spirit of the Lord gave him incredible strength, yes. That dude did some bad stuff. Some really bad stuff. And then to close the book of Judges, there's these two stories that are just terribly disturbing. And the reason they're there is to demonstrate that at this point, even the leadership of these judges, everything has just devolved into this mess of terribleness. It's a great book, isn't it? So what's this part of the story trying to do? Why is this here? I don't know how many of you are literature people. I'm not. I don't understand William Shakespeare at all. Anybody that's like, I love Shakespeare. Anybody? I feel like there's a couple. I feel like at some point, people are gonna be like, why did anybody ever make a big deal? I'm not saying he's not great, he probably is. I'm just saying at some point, probably, we're gonna get to this place where it's I can't even read I can't read it. It doesn't make sense. Are you aware that several of William Shakespeare's greatest known works would be classified as tragedies? Right? Well, that's why the book of Judges exists, I think. The same reason. See, some of the works of William Shakespeare that are world famous, world renowned, that maintain, they're still put on in plays, and there have been 1,000 different variations, and are because he wrote about real things. And unfortunately, life is not always good. Often life is tragic. And so what we see, what is, I think, and if you're a Shakespeare nerd, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think what we see in William Shakespeare is that he wrote about real things that real people dealt with, and he didn't just wrap it all in a nice pretty bow like it all works out in the end. But the stories were tragic. They dealt with real life things. And so too, the book of Judges is a book about very real things, about this heart condition of humanity that if we're not aware of it, we will just repeat the cycle the same way Israel did. If we don't fight hard against it. See, when I read the Old Testament as a whole, I see this incredible case study on the things that will totally derail us. And that anecdotally in my own life and in the lives of people that I've worked with over the years as a pastor, I see the same patterns play out again and again. We get to the book of Joshua, and there's this mountaintop moment where we've been kind of fighting and rebelling against God, and finally we give in, and God does incredible things in our life, and then we get complacent. And when we get complacent, things have a tendency to go and spiral into total destruction and chaos. Now, they might not spiral the way they do in the book of Judges, but in the worst of cases, they absolutely do. Why? Well, the writer of Judges identified it. We're going to jump back to chapter 2, verse 10, where I said there was this pivot point in the story. After that whole generation, Joshua's generation, had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done. Now, I don't know about your life. I can only speak for certain to mine and for certain to those of you whose stories I know. But how often in your life, how often in your faith, have you found yourself at a spot where you're like, I don't even know what happened, but I'm a mess? How often has that happened because you have forgotten the Lord and forgotten what he's done? In my life, always. 100% of the time. When I find myself in a place where I look back and I'm like, how did I ever get here? It's because I have forgotten the Lord and I have forgotten what he's done. Now, those two things play hand in hand, because when you remember what the Lord has done, it's hard to forget the Lord because what he's done is so great. It's why we sing songs like Goodness of God and Firm Foundation and Trust in God. It's to remind us, hopefully, it's why we take communion once a month, to hopefully help remind us of just how good God is. Because when we forget how good God is, we truly forget who God is. And when we forget who God is, what happens? Well, what happens is exactly what happens in the book of Judges in chapter 8 of the Bible. When we forget God and what God has done, things plunge into chaos and destruction. And they do for a very specific reason. At the end of the book of Judges, there's this repetition. Anytime you see repetition in the Bible, it's something to pay attention to. It's usually indicative that there's something important happening. In the book of Judges, 2 times in the last 5 chapters, now, admittedly, this is a little bit of repetition. It's not a lot, but it gets more significant in a moment. We'll get back to that. But there is the exact same line repeated twice. And it bookends. I told you that we go through the 6 judges, and then there's these 2 stories that are just brutal, terrible stories that illustrate just how bad things have gotten in Israel. These 2 verses bookend those stories. It's at the beginning, and then they go through the ugliness of the 2 stories, and then the very last line of the book of Joshua. Judges 17:6 and Judges 21:25 both say, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. That's why we plunge into chaos when we forget the Lord. Because when we forget the Lord and we forget what God has done, what we do is we make decisions that seem right to us. But we're bad at it. Now, if you've been walking with the Lord a long time, maybe you're better at it than you used to be. Hopefully, you're better at it than you used to be. But there will still be moments in time where your flesh tells you to do a thing and you just can't see the consequences of that thing. You just don't have the perspective. You're limited. You can't see what God can see. And so you make a decision, you take an action that ends up causing destruction and chaos, either for you or for someone else. And it's not because you're a bad person fundamentally, it's because you can't see what God can see. When we forget the Lord and when we forget what God has done, we do what seems right in our own eyes. When we don't have a leader to help us see what is right, we do what's right in our own eyes. And when we do that, we end up creating gigantic messes. Again, anecdotally, I don't know that I've ever talked to someone who's like, you know what? The times in my life when I have been the most successful, when things have turned out the absolute best, are the times when I have paid attention to no one else except for me and what I think. I've never met someone who said that, ever. Ever. I mean, you guys are smart people. Sometimes we get decisions right? Because you're smart. But sometimes we get decisions really wrong that we thought were the right decisions. Or that maybe we just didn't think about all that much at all. We were just relying on our own capacity. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. They did what they saw fit because they had forgotten the Lord. I've ranted before here, and so I'll do it very briefly now, about how troublesome the phrase like live your truth is to me, or the phrase follow your heart is to me. That's terrible advice. Your truth and your heart are gonna lead you down all kinds of paths of destruction. What you need is truth and reality that doesn't change. A sense of right and wrong that is from something far beyond you and your ability to understand. What I need is a sense of truth and reality that is far beyond my ability to see and understand. I need the truth of God in my life, because when I don't behave according to who God is and what He has done and what He has called me to, I make messes of everything that I care about. And my guess is you do too. Because we might be very different people, but in our cores, we're not that different. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. Those bookend those 2 stories. The very last line of the book of Judges. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. So what I want you to see today is this. Chapter 8 of our storybook, they framed it in a way that kind of makes people look like heroes. I don't think they're heroes. I think when you read the book of Judges beginning to end, what you see is this cycle of destruction and pain and terribleness that ends with the writer of Judges saying, when you do what you see fit, things don't turn out very well. It's a tragic story of the downfall of the nation of Israel. And this might strike you as odd because we are kind of taught to see the Bible as just all positive. But it is important to understand that often what the Bible is trying to do is reveal the inner depth of darkness that can live inside each of us and that does live inside humanity as a whole. That's not the most encouraging thing, but as any good tragedy, it's real. And it's important to understand the reality. See, we're drawn to stories of triumph, but we're also drawn to stories of reality. And what Judges is doing is showing us that when we forget God and when we forget what God has done, we do what we think is best. And there is a cycle that happens that leads to all kind of terribleness. So while chapter 8 in the storybook ends kind of like positive-ish, the book of Judges ends terribly. It leaves you with a couple of the worst stories in the whole Bible. Why? So you'll sit in the reality of brokenness. See, the Bible is not primarily a fact book. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying there aren't facts, but I'm saying it's not primarily a fact book. It is meditation literature. What that means is it is designed for us to sit in it and meditate and think on it and consider it. And then draw these parallels and go, oh man, well, like we just came out of Judges where God had finally given them the promise and it's be strong and courageous. And then we get to the last part and Joshua says, hey, choose whom you're going to serve. Choose. And then we get to Judges and we see that like right away the people forget about that. And when they do, things just go, and then by the end they're just doing whatever they see fit and it's terrible. Oh, well, maybe that's a pattern that I'm susceptible to too. See, we're intended to sit in it and to ask those questions and to think about those big things. And so the point of the book of Judges, I believe, is to sit in the reality of the brokenness that spiral leads to. So hopefully you can avoid the spiral yourself. And the solution to it is simple. It's exactly what Israel got wrong in verse 10, chapter 2, verse 10. The solution to it, if you want to avoid that spiral of just ugliness in your life, is to remember the Lord and all he's done. That's it. Remember the Lord and all he's done. Remember the Lord and all he's done. Remember what God has done in your life. Remember the way that he saved you and that he set you free from the curse of sin and death. Remember the ways that he's walked with you through seasons where maybe it felt like he was very, very far away, but then as you look back, you realize, oh, he was with me the whole time. Remember the incredible beauty that he's brought out of brokenness. Remember the ways that he's taken dead things and brought new life from them. Remember the ways that you tried to change yourself and you tried to, but then God just like gave you love and gave you peace and gave you joy that was beyond what you ever had inside you. Remember what God has done. You know, the other thing that's so incredible about the story, not the storybook, but the story of the Bible, is that we also have the evidence of what God has done throughout the generations. And one of the things that's so incredible to me is that when I read the story of the Bible, I see myself in this book. I see myself in the running away from God that Israel did throughout the Exodus story. And then I see myself in the triumph of what happens in the book of Joshua. And then I see myself in just this destructive downfall that happens in the book of Judges. I see all the same patterns in my own life, in my own heart. I see how God has been with me through all of it. And then I can look at these stories and go, wow. God does things the exact same way today that he did then. He still moves in the same ways. He still works in the same ways. And so I don't just have the stories from my life. I have the stories from the biblical narrative of how God walked with his people for thousands of years. And you want to know part of why I believe so much in the local church? Because I have your stories too. As I look around the room, I know so many of your stories. But when you're a small church pastor, you get to know people's stories. I know so many of your stories. Not all, but many. I know where you've been. I know what God has done in your life. I know the incredible journey that you've been on. And it encourages my soul and my spirit, and it reminds me of who God is and what God has done. See, if you do it all in isolation, you never learn other people's stories. You aren't able to be encouraged by what God has done in their lives. Remember the Lord and remember all he's done. If you want to avoid the spiral, that's all that it takes. But I don't want to end today on kind of a heavy, the book of Judges is this terrible tragedy book. It is. But as God always does, he has a tendency to point us forward with hope and expectation in seasons that aren't very good. And Judges does that as well. I read to you Judges 17:6 and Judges 21:25. There are actually two other times where this same refrain is repeated in the book of Judges, right there at the very end. 4 times in the last 2 stories of the book of Judges, we see these lines. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. It happens again. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. There are 2 other times where they repeat half of that phrase. Judges 18:1. In those days, Israel had no king. And then Judges 19:1. In those days, Israel had no king. I told you to pay attention when the Bible repeats stuff. Those 4 repetitions of in those days Israel had no king are a direct line pointing forward to what's about to happen in the books of Ruth and 1st and 2nd Samuel and how God redeems his people. And that's what happens beginning next week in the story. So as you enter into chapter 9 this week in your personal time, keep in mind where we've been. Chapter 8 is not just about Gideon and Samson and Ehud and Othniel and Deborah and all these judges. In reality, the book of Judges, chapter 8, should be all about how Israel plunged themselves into destruction, but in the midst of it, God was still working in his upper story to deliver his people from the destruction they had wrought in the lower story. And what God does beginning in the book of Ruth is nothing short of incredible. So we'll explore it next week.